In the spring of 1890, a reporter walked out of a stone prison on the high plains and never published another word under his own name. He had been inside for 3 days. He had spent those 3 days in a corridor the guards did not like to walk, sitting on a wooden stool outside a cell built wider and taller than any other cell in the building, interviewing the man who was kept there. That man was scheduled to hang at the end of the month, and by every account that has come down to us, he stood somewhere near 9 feet tall. The reporter's name, as well as it can be established, was Elias Renner, and his byline had appeared for several years in a daily paper in a river town of the northern plains. The article he carried out of that prison was never printed. His editor killed it before it reached the press. The notebook he had filled with the prisoner's words was, according to the people who later told this story, taken from him, or lost, or destroyed, depending on the version one hears. What survives is not the article, and not the notebook. What survives is the account of a man who said he had been the last reporter ever permitted to speak with a giant, and who spent the rest of his life insisting that what the giant told him in those 3 days was true. If you have ever stood inside an old building, a courthouse, or a railway hall, or a bank raised in the last century, and felt that the room around you was built for something larger and stranger than the business now conducted in it, then this story will not feel entirely foreign to you. Tonight we are going to walk through what Elias Renner claimed the prisoner confessed before he was hanged. We are going to look at why a regional newspaper would refuse to print an interview that every editor should have wanted. And we are going to ask why a growing number of people believe that the man in that cell was not a curiosity or a criminal at all, but a witness, and that he was hanged because of what he could remember. Before we go further into this quiet and troubling corner of history, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. These stories take a great deal of careful research to assemble, and the only way they continue is if you are here to receive them. Subscribe now, settle in, get comfortable, and let us begin. To understand why a newspaper would bury an interview like this one, you have to understand the world that Elias Renner was working in, and in particular you have to understand how common stories of giants were in the American press of that decade. We tend to imagine the 19th century as a sober and a documented age, but its newspapers were full of accounts that no modern editor would print. Reports of enormous skeletons unearthed by farmers and railroad crews appeared in papers across the country with a regularity that is genuinely difficult to explain. A plough would strike something. A grading crew cutting a rail bed through a hillside would expose a row of stone slabs, and beneath them the papers said again and again were the bones of men far larger than any man should be. These reports were not confined to the cheap and sensational sheets. They appeared in respectable county papers, written in the flat and factual language those papers used for a barn fire or a grain price. They named the farmer. They named the township. They gave measurements, and the measurements were consistent in a way that an invented story usually is not, describing thigh bones and jaw bones and rows of teeth that implied a living height of 7, 8, and in some accounts 9 feet and more. And then, almost without exception, the same thing happened to every one of these discoveries. The bones were gathered up by someone of authority, crated, carried away, and never seen again. Where the bones went is a question that the people who study this subject return to constantly. In account after account, the remains were said to have been collected by men from a museum or an institution back east, men who arrived quickly, took possession of everything, and left no receipt. The discovery would hold the local paper for a single week, and then the story would end, and the bones would pass out of the world as though they had never been lifted from the ground at all. Whether you find that pattern sinister or simply careless, the pattern itself is real, and it is the soil out of which the story of Elias Renner and the prisoner grew. The institution most often named in these accounts then and now is the great National Museum in the capital, and it is worth being careful and fair about that. There is no surviving document, no ledger or letter, that proves a national museum ever ordered the suppression of a single giant skeleton. What there is, instead, is an absence, across decades of these reports, with their named farmers and their careful measurements and their crates carried off to a railway siding. Almost nothing physical was ever retained, catalogued, and left available for a later person to examine. The skeptic says this is because the bones were ordinary, misidentified animal remains, or the bones of large but unremarkable men, exaggerated by excited country correspondents. The believer says the absence is itself the evidence. Both sides, in the end, are arguing about a silence, and a silence can be read in more than one way. The prisoner himself had come to the attention of the authorities the previous winter. The accounts of how he was taken differ, as the accounts of this whole affair always do, but the outline they share is this. In a remote stretch of country, far from any town, 2 men had died. They had been part of a survey party, or a grading crew, or a crew sent to break ground for a new line of construction. Their bodies were found near the foot of an old stone structure that the official reports described, with a noticeable lack of curiosity, as a rock formation. And living in that structure, or guarding it, or simply refusing to leave it, was the giant. The structure itself deserves a moment, because the surviving accounts linger on it. It was not a natural outcrop, whatever the official reports preferred to call it. The few descriptions that come down to us speak of fitted stone, of blocks so large and so closely joined that no mortar showed in the seams between them, of a doorway taller than 2 men standing one above the other and worn smooth along its edges, as though by a great many hands across a great many years. It stood alone in empty country, miles from anything a map would name, and the survey crew had been sent there, the accounts say, precisely because someone in an office far away had marked that spot and wanted to know what was on it. They found out, and 2 of them did not come home. He did not run. A man of his size, in open country, could not have hidden, but the accounts are clear that he did not even try. When the larger party came for him, he allowed himself to be bound and led away, and he travelled to the prison without violence and without complaint. He was charged with the deaths of the 2 men. He never denied the charge, and he never explained it. He said only, according to what Renner later reported, that the men had been digging where they should not have been digging, and that he had asked them more than once to stop. The prison that received him was a grim stone building on the high plains, a territorial penitentiary, in a part of the country that was still only a few years away from statehood. It burned in the first decade of the new century, and the fire took the bulk of its records with it, which is one reason the documentary trail behind this story is so thin. A cell had to be specially altered to hold the prisoner. The accounts say a section of wall between 2 ordinary cells was opened to make a single space wide enough and tall enough for him to sit upright, and that even then he could not stand fully beneath the ceiling. Elias Renner was not the first journalist to ask for access to the prisoner, but he was, by his own account, the last one ever to be granted it. Several others had come before him in the weeks after the capture, and their pieces had appeared brief and sensational, treating the giant as a monster or a marvel and inviting readers to shudder pleasantly and turn the page. Then, abruptly, the prison closed its doors to the press. No more interviews were given. When Renner applied, months later, he was nearly turned away, and he believed afterward that he had been let in only by a clerical error, a permission granted by an official unaware of the order standing against it. Whatever the reason, the door opened, and Renner walked down the corridor the guards avoided and sat down on his stool and met the prisoner's eyes. What he saw, he wrote later, did not match anything the earlier articles had prepared him for. He had expected a heavy, slow, slack-faced creature, the giant of a cheap engraving. Instead, he found a man who sat very still, who watched him with a calm and unhurried attention, and who spoke, when he finally spoke, in a low and level voice with an accent Renner could not place against any nation he knew. The prisoner was lean rather than massive, Renner said, built long and spare, with hands enormous but precise in their movements. His face was deeply lined, and his eyes, Renner wrote, were the eyes of a man looking at something a great distance behind you. For most of that first day the prisoner would not speak about the two dead men, or about himself. Renner asked the ordinary questions a reporter asks, and the prisoner let them fall into silence one after another. It was only late in the afternoon, when Renner had nearly given up and was gathering his coat, that the giant asked a question of his own. He asked Renner whether he had ever wondered who had built the city his newspaper was printed in. Not the new parts, the prisoner said. The old parts, the heavy stone parts at the centre, the parts that were already standing when the town was young. Renner came back the next morning, and the prisoner was waiting for him, and this time he spoke without being asked. What he said over that second day, and the third, is the heart of everything that has kept this story alive, and it is worth setting down as carefully and as plainly as the surviving accounts allow. The prisoner told Renner that he was old, not old as an aged man is old, but old in a way that Renner found he could neither argue with nor quite accept. Old enough that he had watched the stone buildings at the centre of cities being not built, but emptied. He said that he belonged to a people who had been in the land long before the nation that now governed it, and that his people had not been savages, and had not been few. They had been the builders. They had raised the world that the newcomers had simply moved into. Renner pressed him gently on what that older world had looked like, expecting either silence or the wild and shining nonsense of a madman. He got neither. The prisoner described, instead, something quiet. He spoke of cities that were not loud, of streets that did not stink the way the streets of Renner's own town stank in summer, of long winters passed in rooms that were warm without a fire ever being lit, and without a single cart of coal ever being hauled to the door. He said the buildings had hummed very faintly, a sound a child stopped noticing by the age of 6, because it had always been there, in the way that a child stops hearing a river it was born beside. When the humming stopped, he said, that was how his people first knew that the world was ending. The buildings went silent before the water ever came. This is the point at which the prisoner's account stops being a ghost story and becomes something stranger and more pointed, because what he described to Renner was not merely a lost people, but a lost economy, an entirely different arrangement of how a society fed and warmed and housed itself. The great buildings, the prisoner said, had never been monuments or mere decoration. They had been machinery. The domes and the towers and the long ornamented halls had been part of a system that drew what it needed from the air and the earth and the moving water, and gave it back freely, so that light and heat and power were not things a person bought, but things a person simply had, in the way that a person has the air. A world arranged in that way, the prisoner told Renner, has no place in it for certain kinds of men. A society in which warmth and light and the means of life are freely available is a society in which no one can grow rich by selling warmth and light and the means of life. There is nothing to own. There is nothing to withhold. And so, when the old world ended, the prisoner said, and he was vague and heavy in the way he spoke of how it ended, describing rising water and a deep mud and a long darkness, the men who built the new world out of its wreckage faced a choice. The buildings were still standing, the machinery was still there, but to let it work was to make themselves unnecessary. It is worth slowing down here, because this is the part of the prisoner's account that reaches past the usual talk of lost cities and into something colder and more familiar. He was describing, in the plain words of a man who said he had watched it happen, the deliberate construction of scarcity. An economy, he told Renner, is not a law of nature like the turning of the seasons. It is a set of arrangements that some people make and other people are taught to mistake for the weather. The arrangement the New World chose was one in which the ordinary household could not survive a single winter without buying its survival from someone who owned the means of it. Coal had to be bought, light had to be bought, later the power humming in the wire had to be bought. Every hearth in the country became a small account, paid into for the whole of a life, and a man who had to pay forever for his own warmth was a man who would work and would obey, and would not ask troublesome questions about the older buildings at the centre of his town, so they did not let it work. This was the cruelest part of the confession, the prisoner told Renner, and the part the New World had buried most deeply. The inheritors took the old buildings, and they kept them, because the buildings were too solid and too numerous to pull down all at once. But they severed them from their purpose. They taught their children and their children's children that the domes and the towers had been raised as ornament, as the vain and costly decoration of kings and churches and corporations, and that the only way to have light and heat and power was to buy it week after week for the whole length of a life. The prisoner had a particular thing to say about the great fairs, the expositions that rose in American cities in those very decades, the white cities of domes and colonnades that drew visitors by the million and were then, within a year or two, almost entirely torn down. Renner had been to one. The prisoner said that the fairs were the trick performed out in the open. They were the old buildings, or buildings raised in the old manner from what could still be salvaged, presented to the public as something temporary, something the modern age had produced easily and could therefore discard without loss. Show a people that their grandest buildings are disposable, the prisoner said, and they will never again ask who truly built them, or why those buildings can do what the new buildings cannot. And this, finally, was where the prisoner explained himself, and explained why a lean old man in a stone cell believed he understood the shape of his own coming death. His people, the builders, had not all died when the old world drowned. Some had remained. They were few, and they were scattered, and they were enormous in a way that could not be hidden. And they remembered. They were walking records. A giant who could stand in a city street and say, plainly and without doubt, that the building behind him had once been warm without coal and bright without wires, and that he himself had seen it so, was a danger of a kind that no argument could ever answer. You cannot reason a living witness out of the world. You can only remove him. That, the prisoner told Renner, was the true reason behind the pattern that Renner already knew, the pattern of giant bones lifted from the ground and carried away, and never seen again. It was not the dead giants that the new order feared. The dead are quiet. It was the living ones. The bones were gathered so that no one could assemble them and stand them up and ask a question. And the living were gathered too, one by one, across many decades, and were dealt with quietly, in places like the prison Renner was sitting in, under charges that gave the dealing a lawful shape. The prisoner did not present any of this with anger. He presented it, Renner wrote, the way a man describes the weather, as a thing long since settled and far beyond the reach of complaint. On the third day, Renner asked the prisoner at last about the hanging. He asked whether the man was afraid. The prisoner said that he was not, and that the deaths of the two men near the old structure had been a sad thing, but not the thing for which he was truly being hanged. He had been sentenced, he said, long before he had ever been charged, by the simple fact of being what he was, in a world that had decided his kind should not continue. The trial and the rope were only the lawful clothing on a decision already made. He told Renner that he did not want the reporter to try to save him, because he could not be saved, and that he wanted only one thing, which was that the account be written down and be kept, so that somewhere the words would exist, even if no one believed them for 100 years. Renner left the prison and went back to his paper and wrote the account exactly as he had been asked to write it, and his editor refused to run it. The reasons given were the reasonable ones an editor always has, that the piece could not be confirmed, that the prisoner was plainly a diseased and deluded man, and that to print his ravings was to mock both him and the readers. Renner argued, and Renner lost. Within the month the prisoner was hanged, and the accounts say the gallows had to be rebuilt larger to do it, and that the burial was done quickly and without a marker, and that the location of the grave does not appear in any record that survived the later fire. Elias Renner did not let the matter rest, and it cost him. He tried to place the account with other papers and found doors closing that had once stood open to him. He came to believe, and he said so openly, that his own editor answered to men with money in the new industries of power and light and rail, the very industries that the prisoner's confession had named as the keepers of the new scarcity, and that the killing of his article had been less an editorial judgment than a quiet instruction. Whether that belief was sound, or was only the bitterness of a man whose great story had been taken from him, no one can now say. He spent his later years as a marginal figure telling the story to anyone who would sit and hear it, and the notebook, the one piece of hard evidence he had ever held, was gone, and he could never say when or how. If you have spent any time among the people who study what they call Tartaria, the shape of the prisoner's confession will already be deeply familiar to you, because it is, almost point for point, the Tartarian account of the recent past. That view begins with the same observation the prisoner pressed on Renner. It looks at the monumental architecture of the 18th and 19th centuries, at the fairs raised and raised within a single season, and it concludes that the official story cannot bear the weight of what is plainly standing in every old city. It proposes an earlier, advanced, and deliberately forgotten civilization, and a great catastrophe often described as a flood of water and mud, and a new order that inherited the ruins and quietly rewrote their meaning. The prisoner simply added the giants into it, and gave the rewriting a motive that was not pride, and was not malice, but was money. It is a strange and a haunting account, and before we allow it to settle too comfortably, we owe it the same hard look we would give to any claim, and the prisoner himself, if Renner reported him faithfully, would not have objected to that. The difficulties with this story are real, and they are serious, and the most serious of them has a name, and the name is the Cardiff Giant. In 1869, just over 20 years before Renner sat down outside that cell, workers digging a well on a farm in the state of New York uncovered the figure of an enormous man, over 10 feet long, apparently turned entirely to stone. Crowds came by the thousand and paid to see it. Newspapers carried it across the country. And the whole of it was a deliberate fraud, a block of gypsum carved by hired men and buried a year earlier by a relative of the farmer, expressly so that it could be dug up and exhibited for money. The Cardiff Giant tells us something that no honest account of this subject can leave out. The American public of exactly this period wanted giants to be real, would line up and pay to see them, and could be moved in enormous numbers by a giant that was nothing more than shaped stone and a great deal of nerve. There is a medical truth here as well, and it is not a cruel one, but it does a great deal of the explaining. There exists a condition, well understood today, and caused by a disorder of a small gland at the base of the brain, that drives the body to grow without the ordinary limit. People with it can reach extraordinary heights, well beyond 8 feet, and they often have the long spare build and the heavy, deeply lined features that Renner described with such care. They also, when untreated, tend not to live very long, and in the 19th century such a person had few places in the world, and was very often exhibited as a marvel, or, if poor and friendless and unlucky, with the law simply confined. A genuinely enormous man, ill and dying and strange of speech, in a prison cell in 1890 requires no lost civilization at all to explain him. Ordinary medicine explains him. There is also a pattern in the way that stories of this kind grow, and anyone who has followed them for any length of time learns to recognize it. A small and plausible event sits at the centre. A genuinely tall and sick man really was held in a frontier jail. A real reporter really did interview a strange prisoner. Around that modest centre, with each retelling across the decades, a new layer quietly settles. His confused and rambling speech becomes a clear and ordered revelation. The lost notebook acquires its precise and damning detail. The editor, who may simply have spiked a thin and unconfirmable story, becomes the knowing agent of hidden industrial masters. No single teller invents dishonestly. Each one passes on the version received, and perhaps without ever knowing it, sharpens one edge or rounds out another. Because a sharper story holds a listener far better than a vague one. After 100 years of that, the tale carries the polished surface of something witnessed and recorded, when it may only be something slowly and lovingly grown. And then there is the matter of the notebook, which no one ever saw and which was always already lost, and the matter of the prison fire, which conveniently consumed the records that might have confirmed or destroyed the tale. A story whose every piece of supporting evidence has vanished by the time the story reaches us is a story that has, in a quiet sense, been built that way. The newspaper culture that Renner worked in did not only report hoaxes, it manufactured them cheerfully and often because a marvel sold papers. It is entirely possible that Elias Renner was not a suppressed teller of the truth at all, but the author, whether knowing or self-deceived, of one more giant to set down beside the giant of Cardiff. And yet, when the sceptical account has done all of its work, and it does a great deal, something is still left over, and it is worth being honest about what that something is. It is not the bones, and it is not the prisoner, and it is not Elias Renner. It is the buildings. The skeptic can dissolve the giant into a sick and lonely man, and dissolve the notebook into a convenient fiction. But the skeptic still has to walk past the same old courthouse, the same vast railway hall, the same stone bank built far heavier and far grander than its business has ever seemed to need, and the genuine strangeness of those buildings does not dissolve along with the rest. The recent past really did build with a conviction and an abundance that the present can only stand and look at, and really did tear a great deal of it down again with a speed that is hard to comprehend, and no conspiracy at all is needed for that to be unsettling. Perhaps the truest reason a story like this one survives is that it gives a clear and a human shape to a loss that is otherwise too large and too vague to hold steadily in the mind. We do live among the inherited buildings of a world that was, in real and undramatic ways, richer in craft and slower in its making than our own. We have, in real and undramatic ways, forgotten who raised much of what we walk past every day. The story of the giant in the cell takes that quiet and formless feeling and gives it a face and a voice, a low and level voice describing a warmth without coal, and a date and a rope. The face is almost certainly invented. The feeling underneath it, the sense of having inherited a world we no longer fully understand, is not invented at all. The prison is gone. It burned, as old stone prisons did, and the plains wind has had more than a century now to move across the place where it once stood. Elias Renner is long dead, and so is whatever paper he carried, and so is the question of whether one word of his account was ever true. The giant, if there was a giant, lies in an unmarked grave whose location no living person knows beneath a sky that has forgotten him, as completely as he told Renner it was meant to. Rest now. Let the old prison fall back into its rubble and the unmarked grave keep its quiet on the high plains. Let that last reporter close his notebook for the evening and trouble you no further. Whatever was confessed in that cell, if anything at all was ever truly confessed, has waited a long time already, and it can wait until the morning. There is nothing here for you to solve and nothing for you to carry. There is only the dark and the soft settling of an old story into rest and the slow and certain arrival of sleep.